The sharp clang of metal striking dirt broke the quiet of the morning, startling a few neighbors halfway through their first cup of coffee. Heads turned toward Richard's yard, where he stood gripping a long metal rod, pounding it into the ground with steady force. Twack! Twack! The sound echoed again and again as he drilled hole after hole scattered across his lawn. "What's he up to this time?" Mrs. Henderson muttered from her porch, shaking her head with a smirk. "That man's completely lost it." A few neighbors gathered by the fence, whispering and laughing softly. Richard was known for his odd habits, but this one looked especially strange. Some guessed it was another failed garden idea or one of his weird projects that never quite worked out. Still, Richard didn't slow down. The once tidy grass was now covered in neat rows of small holes, but he didn't seem bothered by the looks or the quiet snickering. His focus stayed locked on his task, his movements calm and deliberate. "What could he possibly be doing?" one man muttered before turning away, shaking his head. Yet the steady rhythm of metal on dirt went on, drawing more curious eyes from behind curtains and across driveways. The neighbors traded glances, confident this would end like all his other attempts, half-finished and pointless. The judgment hung in the air, a mix of amusement and pity. Richard's lawn, once the pride of his corner lot, now looked ruined. Still, no one thought to ask him why he was doing it. They just watched, convinced he was wasting his time again. But Richard didn't flinch. Day after day he kept working, ignoring the murmurs and stares. The holes spread across his yard in careful patterns, lines and curves that made no sense to anyone watching. Curiosity slowly shifted into confusion and then impatience. Surely something had to come of it. No one, however, was ready for what came next. Those holes weren't random at all. Richard knew what they said about him. He'd heard the whispers for years. Ever since he moved into this quiet suburban neighborhood, he'd been the odd one out. While others clung to routine, Richard dreamed differently. And though they laughed behind closed doors, he kept going, because this time he had a plan. The whispers about Richard had started long before the holes appeared in his yard, back when he first moved in. Rumors spread quickly. Some said he was a failed inventor, others thought he was hiding from something shady. The truth was far less dramatic. Richard was a retired engineer who'd once worked for a top tech firm, the kind that built cutting-edge inventions most people never even heard of. His curiosity and drive had always made him different, but in this tidy neighborhood, different wasn't exactly welcome. The first real clash came when he tried installing solar panels on his roof, a project he was proud of, but one that clashed with the street's picture-perfect look. The HOA stepped in with a complaint, and soon neighbors were whispering that Richard didn't fit in. From there, things only went downhill. His garden experiments were called strange, his small garage workshop an eyesore. The tension peaked last summer when Richard suggested a community plan to make the neighborhood more energy efficient. His ideas were thoughtful and ahead of their time, but no one wanted to hear them. To most of his neighbors, he was just an oddball, eccentric, maybe even annoying. To Richard, they were too narrow-minded to see past their neat lawns and daily routines. It had turned into a quiet standoff that never really ended. Now, as he drilled those holes, he could practically feel their judgment. They thought he'd finally lost it. What they didn't know was that Richard was following a plan, a big one. The holes were just the beginning. A few days later, the drilling stopped, leaving behind an eerie calm. His lawn, now covered in a strange grid of holes, drew more stares than ever, but no one dared ask him what it meant. Late one afternoon, as the sun dipped low, Kim found herself walking toward Richard's house. She was young and sharp, one of the few neighbors who didn't see him as odd. Kim admired him, especially after learning about his past and realizing he'd once worked in the same field she was just starting in. They'd talked before, short friendly chats about her projects and the hurdles she faced. Richard always listened with genuine interest, offering quiet bits of advice but rarely speaking about himself. Today she carried a paper she'd been working on, something she hoped he'd take a look at. Maybe he'd have a few thoughts to share. Kim stepped up to Richard's porch, hesitating a little as her eyes wandered toward the yard. The holes stretched across the grass in a strange, deliberate pattern. She fought the urge to ask about them. After all, it wasn't really her place. When Richard opened the door, she smiled and handed him the paper she'd brought. Still, her gaze drifted back to the lawn, curiosity tugging at her. Finally, she mentioned the holes, her voice careful and polite, not wanting to seem nosy. To her surprise, Richard didn't laugh it off or change the subject. Instead, he looked out at the yard with a calm, almost satisfied expression, as if everything was exactly how it should be. He told her the holes weren't random at all. They were part of a much larger plan, one he'd mapped out carefully over time. He shared just enough to keep her interested, but stopped short of explaining it all. Whatever he was building, he said, would soon make sense. It was something he'd been preparing for years, something only a few would understand once it was complete. Kim listened closely, drawn in by the quiet confidence in his voice. Richard had always seemed like someone who saw the world differently, and now she was sure of it. Every move he made seemed intentional, every detail thought through. Despite the gossip and sideways glances from the neighbors, he didn't seem bothered. He was simply waiting for the right moment to show what he'd been working toward. Not long after Kim left, the doorbell rang. Richard sighed, already guessing who it might be. When he opened the door, there stood Mrs. Jenkins, smiling far too brightly, a casserole dish in her hands. She was the neighborhood's most dedicated gossip, always eager for new stories to share. Richard could see the curiosity dancing in her eyes. She hadn't come to be friendly, just to get answers. Before she could utter a word, he offered a polite nod and gently closed the door. The click of the latch echoed through the quiet house, leaving Mrs. Jenkins and her questions on the other side. Richard wasn't a rude man by nature, but life had worn him down. The years had stripped away his patience for small talk and neighborly chatter. As he closed the door, his mind wandered to his family, people he loved deeply but rarely saw anymore. His son had joined the army right after school, eager to carve his own path. He was stationed overseas now, and though they exchanged the occasional message, the distance between them felt larger than miles. His daughter had married young, moved out of state, and built a busy life of her own. Between work, her husband, and raising kids, visits had become rare. But the ache that ran deepest came from losing his wife. They'd been together nearly 30 years before illness took her, and when she was gone, the house they'd built together felt painfully hollow. She had been his partner in everything, raising their children, dreaming of the future, facing every challenge side by side. Her absence had left a silence that nothing could fill. When she passed, something in Richard quietly broke. Not long after, he left his job, the one that had once given him purpose, and moved to this quiet neighborhood, hoping to find peace in the stillness. But peace never truly came. He kept to himself, avoiding the friendly smiles and idle talk that filled the streets. He no longer cared about blending in or meeting anyone's expectations. Life had shown him enough loss to make him wary of pretending. Now, as he stood in the quiet of his home, Richard turned back to his work. The holes in his yard weren't just another strange project, they were a lifeline. Each one kept his hands busy and his mind focused. But beneath that, they meant something deeper. Each mark in the earth was part of a plan he'd been shaping ever since his wife's passing. It was more than a distraction. It was the one thing that still gave him a reason to keep going. Days went by, and the neighborhood's patience began to wear thin. The holes in Richard's yard sat untouched, their purpose still hidden. Gossip spread faster than ever, with Mrs. Jenkins at the center of it all, tossing around wild guesses, some saying it was an irrigation system, others insisting Richard had finally lost his mind. Then, one crisp morning, everything changed. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, a low hum rippled through the ground. At first it was barely noticeable, but soon it grew stronger, steady, and deliberate. Neighbors stepped outside, glancing toward Richard's yard, unsure of what was happening. And then, without warning, streams of water shot up from the holes, soaring into the air in perfect arcs that glittered in the morning light. The lawn transformed before their eyes into a stunning water display. Dozens of fountains sprayed in graceful rhythm, weaving patterns that shifted with the breeze. At the very center shimmered a small pool, calm and reflective. The whole system, every pipe, every valve, had been built by Richard's own hands. The crowd stood speechless. None of them had expected this. All those days of drilling and planning had led to something far more beautiful than they could have imagined. It wasn't just about building something impressive. It was about feeling alive again. The design, the precision, the engineering, it all echoed the man Richard once was. But beneath that, there was something deeper. Each fountain represented a memory, a quiet tribute to his wife and the life they had shared. Every jet of water was a moment, a laugh, a conversation, a day that had mattered. Richard had built it not for attention but for her. From his window he watched as the water danced in the sunlight, and for the first time in years he felt a calm settle inside him. The neighbors had laughed, whispered, and doubted, but none of that mattered now. The display wasn't for them. It was his way of remembering, of honoring what he had lost. The fountains would stand as a silent promise that even in sorrow, something beautiful could still grow. As the street fell into stunned silence, Richard knew they would never fully understand what those holes had meant. And that was all right. The one person who would have understood wasn't there to see it, but somehow he felt she already had. A few days later, Kim returned to pick up her paper, almost forgetting about it in all the excitement over Richard's mysterious project. But the moment she turned the corner onto his street, she stopped in her tracks. Richard's yard had transformed into something extraordinary. Streams of water arced gracefully through the air, catching the sunlight and scattering it like glass. It was mesmerizing, his lawn now a moving, glimmering piece of art. Kim walked forward slowly, not wanting to disturb the peaceful scene. Richard stood near the fountains with his hands tucked in his pockets, his gaze steady and thoughtful. When he noticed her, he gave a small nod and motioned for her to come closer. She joined him quietly, the paper completely forgotten as she stood there, awestruck. For a long moment, neither spoke. The soft hum of water filled the silence. Then Richard finally turned to her, his voice calm but carrying a trace of emotion. He told her his son was coming home, leaving the military by choice. It wasn't a discharge from trouble or failure. He had simply decided it was time to move on, to start a family of his own. There was pride in Richard's voice, but also a quiet ache that came from years of distance. His son would stay with him for a while, at least until he found his footing again. But there was more. After hearing the news, Richard's daughter had decided to visit too, bringing her husband and kids for the holidays. It would be the first time in years that all of them would be under one roof. Richard smiled faintly as he spoke, a warmth in his eyes that Kim hadn't seen before. For the first time in a long while, his home would be filled again with noise, laughter, and life. Richard turned back toward the fountains, his eyes softening as the water shimmered in the sunlight. He told Kim that after hearing about the family reunion, he had decided to build them, not as a display, but as a way to make sure his late wife could still be part of it all. The fountains weren't just decoration. They were a connection between what once was and what still remained. Their gentle rise and fall, the soft sound of water meeting earth, it all carried the warmth of shared memories. Kim listened quietly, moved beyond words. She finally understood that what the neighbors had seen as strange or foolish was actually something deeply meaningful. The fountains were born out of love, a way for Richard to hold on to the life he'd lost and to welcome his family home again. They were a tribute not just to his wife, but to everything their family had built together. Tears welled in Kim's eyes as she looked around the peaceful yard. She knew the neighbors might never truly understand what Richard had done or why. But she did, and that was enough. With her paper tucked under her arm and her heart heavy but full, Kim walked away from the house. She had always admired Richard's mind, but now she admired something far greater, his heart. His fountain stood as proof that love doesn't fade, it simply changes form. What a touching end to Richard's story. What would you have thought if you'd seen him drilling holes in his yard for days? And do you think his children will cherish this tribute to their mother? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartwarming stories like this one. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.